Today we're at Chepstow, the oldest surviving post-Roman stone fortification in the whole of Britain. It's not actually a particularly defensive castle, but it is a daunting sight. It's imposing. It stands on a cliff over the River Wye and stretches along several hundred metres of cliff on one side, with a valley on the other side, and a slope in front and a big drop behind. So it appears to be a very defensible castle. Chepstow has a varied history from its original foundation. It was built just 1 year after the Norman invasion of England in 1067 under the instruction of Lord William Fitzwilliam. It was originally called Strigwyl and was the southernmost of a chain of castles built across the Welsh marches to dominate and project power into Wales. But it was a much smaller fortress at this time. By the 12th century, when the Normans invaded Wales, they started attacking Gwent, and this was used as the setting off point in the attack on Gwent. Through the 14th, 15th and 16th century, it was owned by a series of Norman magnates, and they basically were the successors of the Marcher Earls who'd subdued Wales. But by the 16th century it had really lost its military significance and was just a very large, very grand house with a series of additions of buildings built, and the castle had been stretched out along the slope. So it's a sloping rock face above the cliffs, and it had more than tripled in size from the original castle of 1067. It was garrisoned during the English Civil War and for a few years after that, but really it fell out of use because it wasn't particularly necessary to subdue the Welsh, the whole purpose that the castle had been built for. And although it commanded wonderful views and made a magnificent house, it wasn't really required militarily. It was good for commanding the River Wye, for trade, and as a very pleasant residence for local lords. So it was abandoned in the 16th century. By the 18th century, it had become a tourist spot, very much overgrown, covered in ivy and with trees growing around the castle. It was a popular destination. And 1799, Charles Heath wrote a now largely forgotten book, The Excursion Down the Wye, from Ross to Monmouth, including memoirs and anecdotes of the life of John Curll. And he was a painter by trade. Well, he was a radical, a painter and a historian, so a bit of a jack of all trades. So his tour book was more about appreciating views that were good for painting. And Chepstow was certainly a beautiful spot to paint. So he made it the last stop where you'd pull over, you'd visit the castle, and then you'd head over to Tintern Abbey, which hopefully you've seen the video on the Unbound History on Tintern Abbey, before finishing at Monmouth. And Charles was a smart guy, so although his tour book was hardly the Lonely Planet or Eyewitness Guides of today, it was more a selection of beautiful scenes to paint, whilst telling people they must go there. He was smart enough to put on boats, so he ran a boat service for people who'd read his best-selling book, so that people could travel down the Wye and this led to an increasing number of visitors to Chepstow. It became very popular for the burgeoning middle class. Those who couldn't afford the grand tour around Europe could certainly sit on a boat and admire the beautiful views down the River Wye. By 1794, Turner had visited and painted a wonderful view of Chepstow Castle from over the Wye. But this sort of belies the history of the building, that it's quite a complicated history in terms of the different owners and how they used it. So we've entered through the far tower. That's all an addition. All of this wall was added much later on when it was extended, largely allowed space for a hall to be built here. So the curtain wall had buildings built along it for storage and for feasting, for residences for people within the family to live. And it really must have been a magnificent home. It's quite a sprawling castle. Not as complicated as Raglan Castle, but it takes up a lot more space. And there's beautiful views over the scenic town of Chepstow, which you can't see through that particular arrow slit. Towers are fairly damaged now, but really you have a very complete plan and a clear idea of how this castle was structured. Defensively, none of the walls were particularly big or strong, but it was very difficult to get from the River Wye side, and from all the other directions you had to climb a very tall bank before breaking through a quite substantial wall. And then you had to fight your way through multiple levels. So it was never really attacked. And it largely was just a very pleasant home for very wealthy lords. Whilst the castle itself would have been ideal even back in the Stone Age and Iron Age as a defensive position, there's no evidence that it was ever settled before the Normans. And when the Normans arrived, William the Conqueror personally committed to the creation of the castle at Chepstow. He knew that if you commanded Chepstow, and particularly this point with the bend on the River Wye, then you commanded all communication between Monmouth and Hereford. And also you could project into the Welsh kingdoms. It's clear there was a need to project strength to the Welsh. Particularly the local king was Rhys ap Tewdwr. So this castle, unlike most Norman castles, was built of stone from the very start. It's rare to find a Norman castle which didn't start out as a wooden one. Berkhamsted, Rochester, Hastings all started off as wooden castles. So this hall was originally, when it was built around 1090, 1 floor high. The second floor was added, and then under later family they split it between 2 brothers, so there's an arch in the middle of the hall that you can make out, which is where the structure is just there on the top left of the screen. And that's where they split the structure so that they could have 2 sides to the hall, and they had private apartments above. And also they built this area much stronger. You can see on the riverside there's quite tall walls, whereas lower down in the castle there is a wall, but it's nowhere near as substantial, whereas these arched walls were built on top, and they began to take defence more seriously from that side. Normans originally called the castle Strigwyl, which comes from the Welsh word Ystrygil, meaning river bend. And it seems that Marcher lords adopted that name, or were given that name over time, So right through till the 14th century, Striguil was what the Marcher Lords were sometimes called. Walking further back, unfortunately there's some scaffolding on the side wall there covering up some of the buildings within this courtyard, which are being renovated at the moment. Hopefully they'll be reopened in the summer. And you can see some of the exposed rock. These rooms start to become larger. You can see where there would have been a beamed roof here. And as you come up the stairs here, there's more and more rooms within the tower. It's a much more substantial structure. There's also some beautiful views over the River Wye. It's very striking. I think we were here when the water was quite low and the mudflats were exposed. It must be very striking when the water's a little bit higher. If you're coming to South Wales, Chepstow is almost the gateway to Wales. As you cross over the River Severn on the motorway, you're heading in towards Chepstow, so it's a very good idea to divert through Chepstow and call in at the castle as the beginning of your holiday or your trip to Wales. Take a look at the tower ahead of you there, and you can see a band of red tile bricks. And quite often you see Norman castles built on top of an old Roman fortification. Here there was no Roman settlement, but they wanted decoration. So when they were building this tower, they went to Caerwent and they found these red tiles in that little strip there, and they introduced them to the tower as a form of decoration, a band of red around it to make it look fancier. Whether they appreciated the Roman history isn't clear, but they just liked those tiles in the structure. Walking back up here, we're at the rear of the castle. We've walked our way through, and I have skipped a few of the rooms and towers because I know you don't want to see hundreds of rooms and towers, but just to give a feel for it. Here, this room sadly pretty much gone. At the back here you've just got the walls, but you can see some magnificent views over the river. The castle itself isn't full of tales of battles and warfare and great significance where it turned the tide, because really its role wasn't to turn the tide, it was to prevent the tide. If you're a small kingdom where you've got men on horseback, knights with swords and spears, shields, but no real weapons of war, no artillery or catapults or anything like that, to be confronted with this huge, substantial castle with very thick walls set up high on a promontory, that alone was enough to put you off. It's almost like the Norman equivalent of mutually assured destruction. You don't use a nuclear weapon because you know the other side will. You don't attack a castle like this because you know you have no hope. So, in many ways, it lived a quiet, peaceful life without any substantial battle. But it's a very striking and important place. Definitely a must visit if you're in this part of the world. And a real pleasure to walk around. Here you see the bend it covered. It was the crossing where that bridge is that was really strategically important. If you held this corner, you could prevent people from driving into England or from travelling too much around a lot of this part of Wales. So from the bottom here, this is in the walk on the far side from the river, you can see how threatening it would be if you were trying to attack. And this is what I mean by its role wasn't to defend, it was to scare you off having an attack in the first place. And here, sort of a bit lacking, I think we were there in the off season, the Field of Gold. One of the key organisers of the meeting of the Field of Gold was based here, and Chepstow was one of a string of castles, so although it had large residence within it, that building there, the section in front of us, is the hall with all the different private chambers on the first floor. But the owners would be Marcher lords. They would have had a dozen castles and moved between them, and all of them had the role of putting the Welsh off the idea of independence or having a united kingdom of their own. Wales only had a single kingdom for 8 years, and these castles were quite key to ensuring that, just as the castles across England, they were pretty much 27 miles, about 1 day's horse ride apart, they put off the Anglo-Saxons from rising against their Norman overlords. And because of these castles and the power of the church and the ownership of land, the Normans were able to subdue the whole of England and Wales with only really a handful of people. There was about 14,000 Normans in 1066, but they were able to dominate the whole country and really prevent any uprisings through brutality and scare people away from uprisings by the sheer scale and force of their castles. But if you want to see a castle which is really defensive and strong and daunting, nearby Caerphilly, and we'll be looking at that soon. So please do subscribe, and we'll be back next Saturday with another Unbound History, looking at an interesting site with some history.